He has never forgotten the day his world was rocked. It was a hot summer day in Charleston, South Carolina, and he was standing outside a building supply store, sweating in his button-down office shirt, when some black delivery guy had eased his son into the building in one fell swoop, like it was a simple thing to do. At the end of the story, leave your opinion below, and don't forget to subscribe, and we'll continue. Greg had just pulled into the parking lot, late for a meeting with the city council people. He was 38, working as a civil engineer, white, well-paid, building bridges, and thought he had everything in life under control. His son, Ethan, 11 years old, was in the passenger seat and already starting to freak out. Some old man in a pickup truck had yelled at them for taking too long to park. Greg leaned out the window and barked, "Move your goddamn white ass." Greg waved him off, muttered something about idiots, but Ethan started rocking back and forth, muttering that everyone hated them, that no one wanted them. Greg leaned across the seat to him and said, "Hey buddy, it's just an old goat, never mind." But Ethan only squirmed harder, not listening. This guy came up. He was unloading paint cans from a beat-up van, thin, 28, wearing a crumpled cap, sweat dripping down his neck. His name tag read Darren. He sat down at Ethan's open window and said, "Hey kid, you see the way my van goes around the potholes? It's like a movie, honestly." Ethan froze, looked up at him. Greg stood there, arms crossed, wondering who this dude was and what the hell he was doing. He shuddered. He hated it when strangers interfered, but he didn't move. Darren didn't even look at Greg, just talked to Ethan, as if his father didn't even exist. Ethan grinned suddenly, the corners of his lips turning upward. He hadn't smiled like that since his mother had left 2 years ago. Greg opened his mouth to mutter, "We'll figure it out," but changed his mind and stayed silent. Darren wasn't showing off, wasn't trying to hurt. He just saw the kid in a panic and did something about it. And Greg stood there like a pillar, wondering why it hadn't worked out for him. That had been about 5 months ago, but that day still lingered in his mind like a thorn in his side. Greg couldn't get the incident out of his mind, even hours after it had happened. He leaned against his car outside the building materials store, watching Darren with growing irritation. Darren, a black deliverman in a tattered cap, chatted with Ethan as if they'd known each other a long time. He jabbed a finger at his van and said with a slight chuckle, "Last week a raccoon jumped out into the road, had to cut around it." Ethan, who was usually silent or panicked, chuckled, briefly but sincerely, something Greg hadn't heard in a long time. Greg felt everything inside clench because he couldn't get that effect. He'd plowed through his job, building bridges and roads to give Ethan a stable life after his mother left. And here some guy in a backwards shirt had done it in 5 minutes with no effort at all. That raccoon stood there staring like I owed him something, Darren continued, looking at Ethan warmly. Ethan laughed again, his shoulders relaxed, and his fingers stopped rubbing his seatbelt. Greg watched this and wondered why he couldn't defuse the situation so easily himself. He stepped forward and said with tension in his voice, "Look, we're fine here. Thanks for coming up to us." Darren straightened up, nodded to Greg, and replied calmly, "No problem, man. Your kid's a real cool guy." Then he went back to his paint cans, whistling something under his breath, without looking back. Ethan gave him a look, then looked at Greg with a slight reproach in his eyes. Greg realized that his son thought he'd screwed things up again with his meddling. Greg's mind reeled with thoughts of how Darren had even dared to poke his head in their direction. He caught himself getting angry, not just because of Ethan, but because of the color of Darren's skin. Greg had grown up in a neighborhood where black guys like Darren were always suspected of something bad. His father, an ex-cop, was always telling him that guys like Darren couldn't be trusted without scrutiny. But this guy wasn't stealing. He wasn't being rude. He was just helping a kid who was freaking out over nothing. Greg stood looking at Darren's van and thought that his anger might not be entirely about Ethan. He didn't like the fact that someone like Darren had shown him how he'd screwed up his own son. It was later that afternoon, close to evening, when the sun was starting to set behind the houses. Greg was still chewing over that incident a couple hours after meeting Darren. He and Ethan were standing outside the office in Charleston, where Greg had driven to after the hardware store. Ethan was sitting in his car, doodling in his notebook, tucked into a page, with a focused look. Greg leaned against the door, staring at his phone, but his thoughts were far from work. He remembered Darren asking Ethan if he liked trucks and showing him how to sketch one. Ethan, who was usually shaking with nerves, relaxed and started drawing under the guidance of this delivery man. Greg watched from the sidelines and felt like a total failure as a father. He built roads and bridges, took pride in the fact that his projects were changing people's urban lives. But here, he couldn't even comfort his own son, and some black guy did it effortlessly. Greg replayed in his head as Darren picked up a pencil and showed Ethan a few quick strokes. Darren's hands, rough, calloused from his work, moved with confidence, and Ethan followed his lead. Greg thought that he himself would have to know how to help his son at times like this. He remembered his father saying that black guys like Darren were always looking for gain or trouble. But Darren didn't pry at Greg, didn't ask anything, didn't boast. He just helped Ethan and left. Greg muttered to himself, "Get it together, Greg, you should have done it yourself." Ethan didn't hear him, engrossed in his drawing of the truck, which was getting clearer and clearer. Greg wondered why he was so hurt that Darren was better than him at that moment. He caught himself thinking that part of his anger was coming from the fact that Darren was black. Old conversations with his father about how people like that weren't trustworthy popped into his head. But Darren gave no reason for suspicion. He just saw a kid in trouble and intervened. Greg looked at Ethan, who was now drawing quietly, and felt shame and irritation struggling within him. He used to think that his job and status made him a good father to his son. Now he wondered if he had missed something important because of his prejudices. It was nearing evening that day when the shadows from the buildings stretched out on the pavement. Greg crossed paths with Darren again that evening after work at the office. He'd taken Ethan to get burgers at a diner near a building materials store in Charleston. Darren was carrying boxes to the back entrance, his van parked against the wall of the building. Greg left Ethan at the fries table and walked over to Darren. He shoved his hands in his pockets and said awkwardly, "Hey, do you have a minute to talk to me?" Darren looked up, wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, and nodded without further question. Greg swallowed and asked what had been running around in his head all day. "How did you figure out what to say to my kid to get him to calm down?" Darren shrugged and answered calmly, looking Greg in the eye, "My nephew's the same way. Sometimes he gets a nervous breakdown." He was silent for a moment, then added, as if remembering something unpleasant, "I was like that myself after my father went to prison." Greg nodded, trying to digest what he'd heard, and asked cautiously, "Your father, is he like that now? Is he okay?" Darren tensed, his jaw clenched, and he said quietly, "No, he didn't make it. The cops beat him up for nothing." He looked away, adding bitterly, "I was 15 when it happened. I still remember it." Greg faltered, not knowing what to say in response, and squeezed out, "That's tough, bro. I'm sorry that happened to you." Darren nodded and said briefly, "Yeah, been there. Life can be lousy sometimes." Then he went back to his boxes, as if the conversation didn't concern him anymore. Greg stood still, looking at Darren's back, and thought about what he'd heard. He'd never faced anything like this: cops, beatings, losing his father at 15. His own father, an ex-cop, had taught him to suspect black guys like Darren of everything. But Darren didn't seem dangerous or devious, he just shared a piece of his life. Greg felt something akin to shame stirring inside him for his old thoughts. He was used to thinking that people like Darren were always hiding something or looking for a benefit. And now he saw in front of him a man who'd been through shit but had helped his son anyway. It was nearing nightfall when the streetlights came on over the diner's parking lot. Greg ran into Darren again a week after that conversation at the diner. He'd taken Ethan to a park in Mount Pleasant to take his mind off his worries. They were walking along the path when Ethan tripped and dropped his notebook into a muddy puddle. The boy immediately panicked, shouted that everything was gone, and began rubbing his eyes with his fists. Greg rushed over to him, pulled some tissues out of his pocket, and said, "Easy, buddy, we're going to wipe it all up now. Don't worry so much." But Ethan didn't listen, only freaked out more, repeating that the notebook was now worthless. Greg felt helplessness growing inside because he couldn't do anything again. Darren came out from behind the trees, unloading bags of mulch for the park nearby. Darren ran over to them, sat down next to Ethan, and said with a smile, "Hold on, kid, we're going to save your notebook. Look what I came up with." He grabbed a stick from the ground and fished the notebook out of the puddle and shook it off the mud. Then he held it out to Ethan and added, "See, it's intact. Let's dry out, and it'll be good, as new. Teamwork." Ethan stopped yelling, wiped his face with his sleeve, and smiled, wide really, for the first time in a long time. Greg stood beside him, watching it and thinking about how Darren had gotten his son out of the hole again. He'd spent hundreds of bucks on therapy, spent nights reading about anxiety, and Darren had solved everything with a stick and a few words. Greg felt his confidence as a father begin to fray at the seams. He looked at Darren and wondered why that black guy was so easy to deal with what he couldn't handle. Greg remembered his father saying that men like Darren weren't worth trusting, that they were untrustworthy. But Darren hadn't just helped, he'd done it without profit, without Ponce. Greg caught himself thinking that his irritation might not just be because of Ethan, but because of old prejudices. He used to think his job and status made him better than the likes of Darren. And now he saw that this delivery boy had shown him what real support was worth. Greg muttered to himself under his breath, "Shit, maybe I've been doing this all wrong from the start in the first place?" It was a week after that evening as the sun set behind the park's trees. Greg saw Darren again a few days after that incident in Mount Pleasant Park. He'd stopped by a construction supply store in Charleston to pick up a couple tools for a job. Ethan wandered down the nail aisle, looking at boxes, until Greg spotted a familiar van in the parking lot. Darren was unloading crates of paint, his cap pushed back, and his shirt soaked with sweat. Greg walked over to him, feeling like he should say something after everything that had happened. He shoved his hands in his pockets and began awkwardly, "Hey Darren, have you thought about taking a bigger job than these deliveries?" Darren lifted his head, wiped his forehead, and looked at Greg with slight surprise in his eyes. Greg continued, trying to sound confident, "I could get you a job with my crew, entry level, pays okay." Darren set the box on the ground, straightened up, and shook his head with a quiet chuckle. He said, looking directly at Greg, "Thank you, Greg, but I'm not talking about offices and stuff, you know?" Greg blinked, not expecting a rejection, and asked with a note of annoyance, "Are you seriously turning down a normal job with good money?" Darren grinned wider and replied calmly, "It's not about the dough. I've seen people like me get squeezed in places like this." He added, looking toward the van, "I like to move around, stay myself. Offices aren't my life." Greg stood there, digesting this and wondering why Darren didn't want what anyone would grab. He used to think that people like Darren should dream of a chance to break through to the top. Greg remembered his father's words about black guys like Darren being lazy and unreliable. But Darren didn't seem lazy. He worked, helped, lived by his own rules without complaint. Greg felt his old thoughts about who deserved would start to crack. He said, trying to hide his confusion, most would jump at an opportunity like this without even thinking about it. Darren shrugged and replied without anger, "I'm not the majority. I don't need to prove anything through your system." Greg looked at him and thought that maybe he was the one stuck in the system, not Darren. He didn't like the fact that this black delivery guy had turned down his offer so easily. It was a couple days after the park when the sun was already high over Charleston. Greg couldn't let go of Darren's words even a couple weeks after that rejection. He decided to find him again because everything inside was seething with questions and doubts. Someone at the building supply store had mentioned that Darren sometimes helped out at a site in North Charleston. Greg drove there Saturday morning, leaving Ethan at home with a neighbor to figure out on his own. When he parked by the old vacant lot, Darren was standing with a group of kids, showing them how to fix a flat bike tire. His hands were covered in mud, his cap pushed to the side, but he looked as calm as ever. Greg walked over, shoved his hands in his pockets, and said, "Hey Darren, wanted to see why you turned down my offer." Darren wiped his hands with a rag, looked at Greg, and nodded as if he had been waiting for this conversation. He sat down on a crate and said with quiet confidence, "I saw how the system broke my father, Greg, you know." Greg leaned against the fence, listening intently, and Darren continued, "The cops, the wardens, they all pushed until he died in prison." He glanced at the boys who were digging in the wheel and added, "I'm not running from it. I just don't want to get involved in shit like this." Greg nodded, trying to take it in, and asked, "You're out here helping the boys. That's a business too, isn't it?" Darren shrugged and replied without pathos, "It's not about business. It's about staying true to yourself." Greg looked at him and thought that Darren saw the world differently than he did. Greg remembered his father saying that black guys like Darren always blamed the system, not themselves. But Darren didn't complain. He just lived his life, doing things for others without asking for anything in return. Greg felt his old beliefs cracking because Darren didn't fit into the picture. He used to think that people like Darren should jump at the chance to rise through a job like he was offering. Now he saw a man who rejected it not out of laziness, but out of principle. Greg said, looking at the set, "You're really doing some good around here. I couldn't do that." Darren grinned and replied, "Everyone does what they can. The main thing is not to lie to themselves every day." Greg returned to the North Charleston site a week after that conversation with Darren. He'd left Ethan at home with his roommate because he wanted to sort out his own thoughts. When he arrived, Darren and a couple of the boys were fixing a broken basketball backboard at the edge of a vacant lot. Greg parked, grabbed a toolbox from the trunk, and approached them uncertainly. Darren noticed him, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said with a slight chuckle, "Hey Greg, decided to get your hands dirty, or did you just come to watch?" Greg nodded in response, feeling that this visit might change something in his mind. He joined in the work, starting to bolt on the shield next to Darren. One of the boys dropped a wrench, and Greg picked it up off the ground first. Greg handed the wrench to Darren, and then held the pole to keep it from wobbling while he worked. Darren nodded to him and said approvingly, "Nice pass, man, you and I are a team now." Greg grinned, not broadly, but genuinely, something he hadn't done in a long time with strangers. He looked at Darren and felt something inside let go, as if the tension of the last few weeks was gone. He'd always wanted to be the one to solve problems, but here he realized he could just help. Darren hadn't made him prove anything. He'd just given him space, and it had worked. Greg thought that maybe he'd been trying to control everything in his life and work for too long. Greg remembered his father saying that black guys like Darren weren't trustworthy or respectable. But Darren was standing there, teaching the boys how to hold the key, and Greg himself was reaching for it without any fear. He caught himself thinking that old prejudices were crumbling as he held this pole. Greg used to think that men like Darren had nothing of value to give because that's how he'd been raised. And now he'd seen this delivery man show him that help doesn't depend on the color of your skin. Greg said as he tightened the last bolt, "You have a real knack with people, Darren. I could never do that." Darren shrugged and replied, "Just giving it a chance. The rest comes naturally, Greg. No fuss." It was a week after that conversation as the sun was setting behind the North Charleston site. Greg started stopping by the North Charleston court regularly 5 months after he first met Darren. He took Ethan with him that Saturday afternoon because his son had asked to play basketball there. When they arrived, Darren was fiddling with the boys at the backboard they'd fixed together the previous week. Greg parked, took the thermos of coffee out of the car, and approached Darren with unaccustomed ease. He poured the coffee into 2 plastic cups, handed one to Darren, and said, "Here you go, bro. Thought you could use a sip today." Darren took the glass, nodded with a smile, and replied, "Thanks, Greg. You're right on time. The boys are getting on my nerves." Ethan ran to the backboard, throwing the ball around with the other guys, laughing like he hadn't laughed in a long time. Greg looked at him and thought that his son had finally found his place among men. He and Darren sat down on an old crate, drank coffee, and were silent for a couple minutes, watching the game. Greg turned to Darren and said, feeling a lump in his throat, "You didn't fix my kid, just let him be himself." Darren sipped his coffee, looked at Ethan, and replied calmly, "Guys like him don't need fixing. You just need to understand them, Greg." He nodded, digesting that, and thought Darren had shown him more than he expected. He remembered his father telling him that black guys like Darren were always trouble or cheating. But Darren didn't cheat, he didn't get angry. He was just there for him, helping the boys and even Greg without asking for anything. Greg felt the last bits of old prejudice falling away like rust from metal. He looked at Ethan throwing the ball and yelling with joy and realized he'd been wrong for years. Greg used to think he had to build a perfect life for his son through work and money. And now he saw that Ethan just needed him to be there for him, really there for him. Darren had shown him that, not by lecturing, but by just doing his thing on the court. Greg said quietly, almost to himself, "I thought I knew everything, but you showed me where I was blind." Darren grinned and replied, "We're all blind until someone pokes our nose in, Greg." It was 5 months after that day outside the store when the morning in Charleston was clear and warm. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you liked the story, please give this video a thumbs up.